Hello and welcome to this video for Spanish 610 Advanced Spanish Translation. What I'm going to present in this video are a handful of key terms and concepts that every translator or translator in training needs to know and understand. These terms and concepts were drawn from a field called translation studies. Now, I don't want to overwhelm you with a bunch of irrelevant theory, but I do believe that what I've done here is to boil down what is essential. Those terms and concepts that will help you, if you understand them, to become a more competent translator. So it's going to be a lot of information, but luckily, thanks to the magic of movies, you can stop, rewind, and review when you need to. So let's get started on this video. Key terms and concepts translators should know and understand. All right, just to give you an idea of the topics we'll cover, I have this lesson overview. We'll start off by talking about definitions, models, and the translation process. Then we'll talk about orienting questions and problem-specific decisions. Then we'll talk about the importance of meaning and what are some of the dimensions and factors that contribute to meaning in texts. We'll talk about genre and genre conventions, which are immensely important. Then I'm going to introduce the 3 basic language functions, 3 equivalence orientations, my take on translation approaches. We'll talk about the unit of translation, a little bit about translation procedures, then we'll wrap up with a discussion of how to review and evaluate translations. Now you might be wondering, why do we even need to study all this? Why don't we just translate, right? Well, I think that understanding theoretical concepts and frameworks provides insight into how culture, language, and meaning relate to each other. Also, if we're familiar with the key issues that have come from the field of translation studies over the centuries, but even more recently in the past few decades, this can help us to ask the right questions before we start translating and to make better decisions as we go. And then finally, learning about the practical aspects of translation, such as how to resolve commonly occurring problems and what tools to use. These things can make us more aware of the options we have as we translate. So long story short, all of this information in this video, key terms and concepts, is going to make you a better translator. So let's start off assuming you know nothing about translation, right? Just some basic terms. Obviously, translation has to do with translating written material from one language to another language. Normally, that material we call the source text, abbreviated ST. That's written in the source language, abbreviated as SL. Some people talk about source culture as well, SC. We're taking that source text, we're translating it, we'll talk a lot more about that in this video, or creating a target text, which is the product of the translation, target text, abbreviated TT, in the target language, TL, for target language readers in the target culture, TC. And I wanted to provide some of the terms in Spanish as well. So the idea of source in Spanish is usually original. So for example, texto original o texto de origen, idioma original. You can also say texto fuente, texto de partida, or idioma fuente, idioma de partida. So those are terms for source text, source language in Spanish. For target text, target language, target culture in Spanish, it's going to be meta, objetivo, de destino. Entonces, por ejemplo, el texto meta, texto objetivo, texto término, texto traducido, or idioma meta, idioma de destino, idioma de llegada, and so forth. So these are just some basic terms. Source language, source text, target language that are used very frequently in translation. All right, on the next few slides, we're going to look at some definitions of translation. All right, so these are not necessarily the dictionary definition. These are definitions provided by people who have written books in the field of translation studies. One is J.C. Catford. He approached translation from a linguistic perspective in his book, A Linguistic Theory of Translation, published in 1965. Catford said that translation is, quote, an operation performed on languages, a process of substituting a text in one language for a text in another. He went on to say, translation may be defined as the replacement of textual material in one language by equivalent textual material in another language. Now, Peter Newmark, who is another very famous and important figure in translation studies, written several books, defined translation this way. Translation is a craft consisting in the attempt to replace a written message and or statement in one language by the same message and or statement in another language. For her part, Mildred Larson, who published a book called Meaning-Based Translation, she defines translation with an emphasis on meaning. And this is one of my favorite definitions of translation, so pay attention. Translation, she says, is basically a change of form. It consists of transferring the meaning of the source language into the receptor language. This is done by going from the form of the first language to the form of a second language by way of semantic structure. But this is the important part that she emphasizes. It is meaning which is being transferred and must be held constant. Only the form changes. Translation then consists of studying the lexicon, the words, grammatical structure, communication situation, and cultural context of the source language text, analyzing in order to determine its meaning, and then restructuring the same meaning using the lexicon and grammatical structure which are appropriate in the receptor language and its cultural context. So in this definition from Mildred Larson, we have many ideas that we'll come back to in the course of this video presentation. All right, and the final definition we'll look at today comes from Susan Bassnett-McGuire. She writes, "What is generally understood as translation involves the rendering of a source language text into the target language so as to ensure the surface meaning of the two will be approximately similar and the structures of the source language will be preserved as closely as possible, but not so closely that the target language structures will be seriously distorted." So you really have to take this definition apart. She's saying that we do want to transfer meaning, but we also want the structures of the target language to be as similar as possible to the structures of the source language. So she emphasizes both meaning and form. So we've seen in the last two definitions in particular, an important concept in translation studies emerge, which is the distinction between meaning and form. Something that gets discussed a lot in translation studies is what is important to emphasize as we reformulate the text. Is it the meaning? Is it the form? Is it both? Okay, so now we're going to look at some visual representations or models of the translation process. So if you remember, a couple slides ago we saw a definition from Mildred Larson. This is the graphic representation that she has provided of her definition. So in her model, we see the source language text, or the text to be translated. The first step then is to discover its meaning. So we have meaning there at the bottom. Remember, for her, it's meaning that is transferred. Meaning is held constant, and the form can change. So she says you take that meaning, you re-express it, that would be changing the form, and you end up with the translation, the target text in the target language. A somewhat similar process or model is the one provided by a translation studies theorist named Eugene Nida and his partner in this book, Charles Tabor, in 1969. In their model, we have the target text, the source text, text A. The first step for them is analysis, interpretation, analysis of the message in the source text, right? We break that down into its most basic form. Then there's what they call transfer. It's transfer. We're transferring sort of that basic message to the target language, and then we are restructuring that, right? We're performing different transformations on that. This model was influenced heavily by Chomsky's work, okay? Surface structure, deep structure. So we're taking that deep structure meaning and we're restructuring it into an appropriate surface structure in the target language. So source text, we break it down, we analyze it to its deep structure. That gets transferred to the deep structure of the target language, and then reverse transformations happen, to use maybe Chomskyan language, that's restructured into an appropriate and equivalent as possible surface structure in the target language, and that's our target text. And then just to give you one more model of the process, this is from Peter Newmark. It's very similar, right? We start with the source language text, the source text. The first step would be comprehending that, and then it's the formulation or reformulation stage in the target language, and that yields the target text. The dotted line where it says interlinear translation here, interlinear translation is word-for-word translation. So that's another option, but he's trying to illustrate that a word-for-word translation doesn't involve the steps of first breaking down the text, comprehending the text, analyzing the text, and then the hard work of formulating or reformulating that meaning in the target language with appropriate target language structures. Okay, so we've looked at some definitions and models of the translation process, and I just wanted to give you my take, my definition. Like I said before, I like Mildred Larson's definition a lot. I like the definition provided by Susan Bassnett-McGuire, and the other ones by Newmark as well, and by Catford. So this is sort of how I put them together. My definition of translation is that translation is a multi-step process whereby various elements pertinent to the overall meaning of a text in one language, its content, purpose, register tone, effect on the reader, among others, are replicated in another language. That's my definition, and we'll break down some of those elements, right? Register tone, effect on the reader, etc. For me, translation is a 5-step process. The first 2 steps are usually done together. The first step is to interpret the source text. We determine the meaning of the source text. In other words, what does the source text mean? The second step is analysis. And again, sometimes this happens simultaneously with interpretation. Analysis means we assess the contributions of several contextual and textual factors to the source text's meaning. Here we're answering the question, not what does it mean, but how does it mean? The third step when we're translating is to strategize. This involves setting an objective for your translation and deciding which equivalency types to prioritize and which translation approach to adopt. We'll be talking more about this in this presentation. The fourth step is what most people think of as translation. That's when we are translating the source text by applying translation procedures. And then a fifth and very important step that should not be left out or overlooked is to review the translation. We review our target text, the product, for accuracy and overall effectiveness. We're proofreading it, we're editing it. So again, this is my definition and my 5-step model of the translation process. Something that anyone who's ever attempted to translate a text understands is that translation involves a process of constant decision making. You're constantly being confronted with decisions. What should I do at this point? I believe that asking the right questions before you start translating can help you to make better decisions as you translate. So we have a distinction between orienting questions and problem-specific decisions. What are orienting questions? Orienting questions are questions you ask before you translate. They guide the interpretation, analysis, and strategizing steps in the 5-part model I just outlined. Ideally, your orienting questions and how you respond to them is going to inform how you handle problem-specific decisions. So what are problem-specific decisions? These are decisions you have to make in order to resolve problems that arise as you're translating during that reformulation step. And these problem-specific decisions then should be informed by your previous analysis and your answers to the orienting questions that you made before you began to translate the text. To help you understand what orienting questions are and how they might be useful in your analysis, I thought it'd be good to provide some examples. So orienting questions are things that will help you to better analyze, break down the meaning of the source text and understand what components, factors, or dimensions of that source text are responsible for contributing to its meaning. So things like, what's the genre, what's the purpose, what's the dominant language function? Is the identity of the text's author important? If so, what is his or her intention? How would you characterize the intended readership of the text? Is its overall linguistic register more formal or informal? What's the overall tone that its language conveys? Is the text's overall style fairly generic, or does it seem unique or peculiar, particular in some way? Does it use a lot of technical terminology, or is its vocabulary just more common types of words? What kinds of grammar forms, structures, and functions stand out in the text? Does it use a lot of passive voice, a lot of past tense, or is it all present tense, for example? Is the text's meaning supposed to be clear and easy to determine, or is it supposed to be vague and open to various interpretations? So these are examples of orienting questions that you should ask of the text, about the text, before you ever sit down and start to translate. So don't skip the step of the orienting questions. Okay, so now we're going to start a discussion of meaning, okay, and why it's so important in translation. Well, meaning and equivalence are the central concerns of translation. There's sort of consensus on that point. And the first step in the translation process, as I've outlined it, is interpretation, to determine the meaning of the source text. The second step is analysis, to assess the relative contributions of various contextual and textual factors to that meaning. Now, it's really important to point out, and a little bit scary, that there is no meaning without interpretation, and it's the translator alone who is tasked with determining what the source text means, and then reproducing that meaning as completely and effectively as possible in the target text. So it's a lot of responsibility. When you get a text to translate, you have to interpret, analyze, and reformulate the meaning of that text, and many times there's no one you can ask. And then finally, it's important to understand that meaning is the product of the author's intention, the information conveyed in a text, and its effect on the reader or listener. This is a very simplified definition, this fifth bullet point, right? To talk about what is meaning, I'm sort of boiling it down to its essence, right? You have the author and his or her intention, you have the content, the topic, the information that the actual language of the text is communicating, and then you have its possible effects on the reader or listener. So there are at least those three elements: the author, the text itself, the listener, the intention, the information, and the effect or the response. Again, just a very simplified definition, but I want to emphasize that meaning is complex. And what I want to convey with this slide here is just a visual of this idea that meaning is a highly complex construct that encompasses a variety of factors. Of course, you have the author, you have the text, you have the reader, but also you have genre and all the conventions of genre. You have language itself, right? You have the topic, the content, and all of this is functioning against a broader contextual web of the cultural norms of a language community or society. So these are just a few of the variables that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to interpret a text's meaning and analyze it. Because meaning is so important, and we're going to refer to a lot of these factors that contribute to meaning in texts, I wanted to break down each one a little bit more. When we're talking about culture, right, we're referring to the values, perspectives, traditions, and the products or artifacts of a society that are transmitted from generation to generation by means of a symbolic discourse, which we're talking about language. So that's culture. What's a genre? We're going to talk more about it in a minute, but genres are text types whose purpose, topic focus, audience, organization, register, tone, and style are set and determined by conventions that are established and maintained by a discourse community in a particular society or culture. Okay, what's language? Hopefully this one we know already, but it's a rule-governed system of human communication. So those things that pertain to language are lexical items, in other words, words or phrases, grammar forms and structures, language varieties like registers, dialects, jargons, etc. The content obviously has to do with the message, the information, the reference, or the referent, or the reality that the text is talking about. So some associated idea are domains, fields, specific disciplines. Okay, so for example, if we're looking at a business text, right, the field might be finance, the content has to do with investment or something like that. The author is the creator of the text, who may be an individual or a collective entity. Many times we don't have the name of the author. It's a corporate author, a collective author. Some associated ideas are the status of the author. How important is the identity of the author? What's the author's intention? Is that even relevant? Many times it's not, unless we're talking about an artistic, a literary, or an expressive text. The reader. The reader is the individual that reads and interprets the text, or the audience to whom it's directed. So associated concepts are things like the expectations of the reader. The reader is associated with the target language and target culture. Readers have biases and things like that. So again, I just wanted to give you a little bit more information about some of these key factors that affect meaning in texts. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit, but not really, because the concept of genres and genre conventions is incredibly important to both understanding how meaning is created in texts, how we should interpret it, and how we should reformulate it. In my mind, we can't understand meaning and translation without a very solid understanding of genres and genre conventions. So, what are genres? Well, genres are culturally determined linguistic frameworks, including specific text types, that are used to accomplish particular social purposes by members of discourse communities who establish and maintain their expressive and interpretive conventions. That's a lot to unpack, but it's basically a text type that has a specific purpose, and that there are rules that govern how this text type is put together and used, and those are set by discourse community members. Another definition is a genre is a text type whose purpose, topic, audience, organization, register, tone, and style are determined by conventions that are established and maintained by a discourse community. It's really important to point out that genre conventions, the rules about a genre, are culturally situated, culturally specific. So even when genres span languages and cultures, certain conventions may differ from one language community to the next because of cultural or societal norms and expectations. Translators who specialize in certain types of texts, so let's say somebody specializes in legal documents or medical documents or information technology documents, that translator is going to develop genre competence. They're going to become very familiar with the genre conventions and norms in both of their languages of the language pair. So specialization is really developing genre competence. And it's really important to develop genre competence, to become as familiar as possible with the conventions, the rules for the type of text you translate frequently, because these genre conventions shape or constrain a lot of the factors that influence the creation and interpretation and reformulation of meaning in texts. For example, it's the genre conventions that determine what the content, the topic, the information of the text can be about. Genre conventions set the purpose. They determine what the appropriate situational factors are. Things like, in what place does the communication take place? In what time? Who are the participants? How important is the author? Who are the readers? Those types of relationships. It also determines the primary or dominant language function. We're going to talk about these in just a minute. And genre conventions determine what types of language use are typical or appropriate in a certain kind of text. So everything from the discursive properties. Discursive properties have to do with how texts are organized. Are they connected? Are there transitions? Are the paragraphs connected? Are the sentences connected? Do they flow? Is there cohesiveness, coherence? The register, that has to do with the degree of formality in a text. When I say register, and this is important, when I say register, I'm talking about, is the language of the text mostly formal or mostly informal? Genre conventions also determine what the appropriate tone of a certain type of text is. The tone is the attitude toward the content or topic that the language used projects. So a description of tone might be something like, this text has a playful tone, this text has a serious tone, this text has a sarcastic tone, this text has a neutral tone, right? Okay, and then the style. Genre conventions also determine what the overall style profile of a text is, what's appropriate, right? Should it be more of a generic, general style, or is it something specific, particular, peculiar? Genre conventions also determine what language variety is appropriate. Is it the standard variety? Is it some type of dialect, regional? Is it a social dialect, a socio-dialect, a sociolect? Or is it a particular jargon, like medical jargon, legal jargon, business jargon? What language variety is appropriate? Well, it depends on the genre. And also, genre will tell us when the inclusion of culturally specific form reality connections are appropriate. Long story short from this slide is that it's important to understand and be extremely familiar with the conventions of a genre because they determine, they fix what appropriate language uses are for certain types of texts. All right, I know it seems like I'm presenting a bunch of random topics, terms, and concepts, but as the presentation proceeds, I'll be connecting them. What I want to talk about now are basic language functions. There was a German psychiatrist and philosopher, his name was Karl Buehler, and he believed that all language use reflects three basic, what he called language functions. And of course, he's being read in translation. One is the expressive function. Another word for this might be the aesthetic or artistic function, which is to express emotions, to express attitudes and values, usually of an individual author. A second language function is informative or representational, and that's to convey information. A third primary language function is the vocative function. For most people, this word vocative is a new word, but it means basically persuasive. It's to appeal to the reader and to elicit a reaction or a response. So what Buehler is saying is that every type of language use, every text is going to reflect one or more of these three basic language functions. It's going to be expressive or informative or vocative. In other words, its primary language function is artistic, representational, or persuasive. It's either trying to express emotion, attitudes, to convey information, or to elicit a response from a reader. Each basic language function emphasizes one of the principal actors in the author-text-reader dynamic. Remember when I defined meaning a few slides back and I said this is a simplified version, but it has to do with the author's intention, the information conveyed by the text, and any possible effect on the reader. Well, these three basic language functions line up with those three actors. The expressive function emphasizes the author, his or her intention, their characteristic style. The informative language function emphasizes the text in the sense that we're talking about its informational content, its message. And the vocative function has the reader in mind because the emphasis is on the response or the reaction of the reader. Now, many texts combine, more than one of these functions, but typically in a text, we can determine which of these basic language functions is dominant. So we can say, in this text, the informative function is the most important. It's trying to simply convey information. In this text, the vocative language function is dominant because it's really trying to elicit a response or a reaction from the reader. Now, what I'm trying to do on this particular slide with this table or chart is to show the relationship or possible relationships between these three primary language functions identified by Karl Buehler, the expressive, the informative, and the vocative, and other elements or other aspects of meaning that we might want to take into consideration, including on the far right, genres. So if we look at something like a film or a novel, the expressive function is typically going to be dominant. It's the author's intention is important. The author's identity or status is crucial. And the domain, the real-world domain, are places like literature, art, music, entertainment. If we have a genre such as a financial document, a financial report, that comes from the domain of business, The author is irrelevant. We understand that it comes from X, Y, or Z company, And typically in those types of business reports, financial documents, the primary language function is dominant, right? By the same token, if we have something like an advertisement, you're reading through a magazine and you come across an advertisement for a new car or makeup, right? So the genre is a magazine advertisement. The real world domain is advertising. The author status is irrelevant. We don't care what individual in real life created that, but the emphasis is on the reader and his or her response. The primary language function is vocative. So on this slide with this chart, I'm trying to show you connections between genre and primary language function. They definitely line up. The next topic I want to introduce is the topic of equivalence and equivalence orientations. Now, most translation theorists and practitioners agree that the goal of any translation is equivalence. Sometimes equivalence is also referred to as correspondence. Most theorists and practitioners don't believe that attaining perfect equivalence or correspondence at every single level of a source text target text pair is a realistic goal. There's going to be translation loss. That's inevitable. This means that the translator might want to think about what types or orientations to equivalence he or she is going to prioritize. So the choice to emphasize a certain kind of equivalence is going to influence other decisions, such as what's going to be your overall approach to the translation, what translation segment or unit size should you focus on, and what translation procedures are going to be the most appropriate to apply. When we talk about equivalence and the idea of equivalence types, what types we might want to focus on, what I call equivalence orientations, this person always comes up, Eugene Nida, who was a biblical translator and translation studies theorist. Now, Nida identified two kinds of equivalence orientations, what he called formal and dynamic equivalence. For Nida, formal equivalence is the idea that the target text message in both content and form should closely match various source text elements. So under formal equivalence, and formal here refers to language forms and structures, the standard for equivalence is equivalence of form. You're going to look at your target text, you're going to look back and compare it to the source text. Do the language forms look alike? So it's the idea of equivalence at the level of language forms and structures, fidelity to language forms and structures of the source language. Formal equivalence is then associated with more literal approaches to translation. You probably are familiar with literal and free translation approaches. We're going to talk about it more in just a couple of minutes. Dynamic equivalence, again, this is another term that Nida introduced. Dynamic equivalence, the second equivalence orientation, has to do with the dynamic relationship between receptor, which is the reader, and message. The idea that it should be substantially the same as that which existed between their original receptors and the message. So dynamic equivalence translations aim at, quote, complete naturalness of expression. The standard for equivalence is equivalence of effect on target text readers. So if you think dynamic equivalence is important, what you're after is that the target language readers experience the text in the same way. It has the same effect on them. Not so much that the language structures are the same as they were in the source text. So dynamic equivalence, since it's aiming for naturalness of expression, right, and it prioritizes the target language reader, is often associated with free translation or freer approaches to translation. So again, summarizing, Eugene Nida introduced two types of equivalence that we can aim for. Formal equivalence, which is equivalence of form, and dynamic equivalence, which is equivalence of the effect on the reader. Now, Peter Newmark, who's another translation studies theorist who we introduced earlier in the presentation, he recognizes, he takes from Nida these ideas of formal and dynamic equivalence, but he also says, hey, wait a minute, you forgot another important type of equivalence, cognitive equivalence, which would be equivalence at the level of content, information, message. Maybe NIDA didn't mention that one because it's a no-brainer. Of course, when you translate, you want equivalence at the level of the content, the information, the message. So for Newmark, right, formal equivalence is, our focus for equivalence is on source text forms and structures, source language forms and structures. We want our target text to reflect those, to be equivalent, as similar as possible. Cognitive equivalence just means equivalence of message, equivalence of information, content. And again, dynamic equivalence, the equivalence focuses on the target text reader and that they have the same response, they experience the text the same way that that source text readers would have. Newmark notes that there are relationships between each of the three basic language functions that we described a few minutes ago and these three equivalence orientations. So if the text that we're looking at that we want to translate, if the dominant language function is expressive, then perhaps Newmark suggests, right, the source text author is important and we might want to prioritize formal equivalence. If, on the other hand, the dominant language function in the source text is informative, it's simply trying to convey information, the emphasis is on the source text message, then we should prioritize cognitive equivalence. And then finally, if our source text, right, the primary language function is vocative or persuasive, then the emphasis is on the target text reader, and we might want to prioritize dynamic equivalence, that the reader experiences the text the same way source text readers did. So it's important to underscore that there is a connection between the basic language function and the type of equivalence the translator might want to prioritize. Okay, the next topic or concept that I want to introduce is the translation approach. Extremely important topic in translation studies. So what are translation approaches? Well, a translation approach is simply the overall strategic posture that the translator will adopt after carefully reviewing the source text and analyzing its key features. So what's the overall strategic posture? How am I going to translate this text? Translation approaches typically apply to individual texts or projects because you make a decision about which approach to apply or to adopt after you analyze that specific text or project. Now, most people know that translation approaches are generally separated into two categories: literal translation or free translation. So I want to give you my definitions, which reflect a lot of reading and study on the topic. Literal translation, the literal translation approach is fidelity to the source text or source language. It reflects source text, source language bias. So if we're doing a literal translation, the source language features are replicated as closely as possible and communicating the message from a source language, source culture perspective. That's what a literal translation will do. It's going to replicate source language features as closely as possible, and it's going to try to communicate the message in a way that reflects a source language, source culture perspective. It's not worried about target language readership, naturalness, and things like that. On the other hand, free translation, if we do a free translation, we are embracing the concept of fidelity to target language and target text reader expectations. It's a target language and target text reader biased approach. So under free translation, target language expressive conventions are preferred in order to convey the message as naturally as possible. We're trying to make it as easy to understand in natural target language as possible for the target text reader. We're not concerned about the forms in the original source text. We're not concerned about the source language reader experience or the source culture perspective. We're trying to make everything as easy and natural to the target language reader. Now, beyond this traditional distinction between literal translation and free translation approaches, there are many typologies and classifications of translation approaches. All right, before I move on and talk about maybe a variation on the traditional distinction between literal and free translation, I do want to just reiterate what literal and free translation approaches look like, what they do. And I think providing an example might be a good way to do this. Okay, so here I have at the top a source text in English, which is the part of the Miranda warning that you might have seen on TV and movies that's read to criminals when they're taken into custody and before they give any statement. On the bottom, I have a source text in Spanish that comes from a review of a really bad movie called Wild West starring Will Smith. Okay, so source text in English and a source text in Spanish, two different types of texts. And I'm not going to go through and read each word of the literal and free versions, but what I want to point out is just, again, as a reminder, a literal translation is going to try to stay true to the source language forms. It's going to try to communicate the message in a way that emphasizes the source language reader's experience in that source language culture. It's not concerned about sounding natural or being easy to interpret for the target text, target culture, target language reader. In contrast, a free translation, and here I want you to pause after I'm done talking, please pause and read this slide in its entirety. In contrast, free translations, remember, are going to, the priority is making the text natural sounding for the target language reader. Free translations are not concerned with the language forms and structures looking the same. They're more concerned with sounding natural, accessible, as if they were written for target language readers. So go ahead and pause right here and just compare the literal and free translations of these two source texts. All right, so hopefully that exercise that we just did on the preceding slide where we looked at different examples will help you to better understand literal translation and free translation, that distinction and how they're different, these two approaches. Now, I think that the literal translation, free translation distinction is very important. It's a very valid construct. But I also think that we can think about translation approaches in a new, different, and potentially more beneficial way. On this slide at the bottom, I've identified 3 approaches to translation that fit within this traditional framework. One is the faithful approach, another is the balanced approach, and another is the creative approach. What these have in common is that they're all influenced and reflect different types of equivalence orientations, but they're focused on how the translator is going to use the target language. So how the translator decides to use the target language to ensure that he or she produces the most effective translation. Okay? So the faithful approach is not going to be common. Maybe in 5% of texts where formal equivalence, in other words, equivalence of linguistic structure, is important. These would be things where the author's identity and the author's particular style is extremely important. Think of a text written by an author that has a very identifiable characteristic style, somebody like Mark Twain, for example, or a song lyric, maybe even a rap lyric or something like that, where the identity of the author is very tied up in his or her characteristic style. In such a text, you could argue that it is important to use the target language unconventionally in order to replicate the stylistic peculiarities of a particular source text author. But that's going to be very rarely. More often than not, maybe in 90% of all translations, you're going to want to adopt what I call the balanced approach to translation, or the balanced use of the target language. This is using the target language naturally so that you attain cognitive equivalence and dynamic equivalence, both, and maybe even a little smidge of formal equivalence. So if we adopt the balanced approach to translation, we're using the target language naturally to convey the same information, the same message, in the same register and tone, so that the target text reader has a very similar experience to the source text reader. Same information, equivalent effect. We're going to use the language naturally. That's a balanced approach to translation. 90% of the time, I would estimate. And then finally, on the other extreme of the continuum, target text reader bias, right? What some people might call an unduly free translation, a very free translation, or even a transcreation. I have what I call the creative approach to translation. Here, the principal concern, the type of equivalence we want to imitate or attain, is very heavily weighted toward equivalent effect, maybe even toward the detriment of the actual message itself. We're going to want to use the target language creatively, primarily to replicate an effect or an impression on the reader. So again, this type of approach is going to be fairly uncommon. So most of the time, our approach is going to be balanced. We want to use the target language naturally, conveying the same information in the same tone and register. Less often, we're going to adopt a faithful, meaning faithful to the author's style approach. And once in a blue moon, we're going to get very creative and do something that, traditionally would have been called unduly free, too free, right? Extremely free, or transcreation. And that's the creative approach to translation. So as we transition from talking about translation approaches to translation procedures, I want to throw in a slide about translation units. What is a translation unit? Well, units of translation are the source text segments that translators focus on when seeking equivalence in the target language. Okay, so we have an example of a source text on this slide that comes from a quarterly earnings report. And it's a paragraph, and I have highlighted or circled in different colors different translation units or different sized translation segments. We have everything from words like the word acquisition to phrases in green. A phrase might be something like acquired assets, or the first quarter, or impairment losses on property, plant, and equipment. That's a translation unit in this text. It might be something as long as a clause, which is highlighted in the gold or yellow color, or a full sentence. Not usual, right? Not as common. It's important to point out that different translation approaches, so literal or free, or even, as I mentioned on the previous slide, my nomenclature, which is, what was it again? Faithful, balanced, and creative, tend to focus on different translation units. So there's a relationship between the translation unit size you focus on for equivalence and the translation approach. For example, just sort of to generalize, the more literal the approach, the shorter the translation unit tends to be. Whereas the freer the translation approach, if you're doing something, the creative approach, right, the longer the translation unit tends to be. All right, believe it or not, we're getting toward the end of the presentation, and we're finally talking about translation procedures. What are translation procedures? Well, translation procedures are the specific procedures that translators apply when they actually are reformulating specific source text units into their target text equivalents. I like to think of translation procedures like the tools the translator has in his or her toolbox, okay? There are dozens of different translation procedures that translators apply to resolve simple and more complex problems as they go. So there literally are dozens. And there is a reading that I can provide that has dozens of different translation procedures. It's like a handyman that has a lot of tools in his or her toolbox, right? All right. Why is it important to know about translation procedures? Because if we're familiar with the procedures, then we know what our options are. It helps us to resolve the problems. It's like a handyman that doesn't know or doesn't have the tool he needs to fix something, right? The more tools he has, the more problems he can fix. So on this slide, what I wanted to do is provide a few examples of translated units or segments, right? Translation units that have been translated. Each unit, in my mind, is underlined. Keep in mind that a translation unit can be a single word, a phrase, a clause, a sentence, or even an entire text. And then what is that target text segment, and what was in orange, right? In the orange boxes, I have my terms for the translation procedure that's been applied. So for example, if I take the phrase to browse the internet, which has two translation units, to browse and the internet, I've translated it as navegar el internet, and that involves the application of two different procedures. The use of a lexical equivalent, because if you look in a bilingual dictionary for to browse, you're going to find navegar. And the internet, translated as el internet, is actually not a Spanish word. It's a loan word transfer from English to Spanish, but that's what we use. A unit like, and this is a single unit of translation, the Texas Argentine Chamber of Commerce, if I translate that as La Cámara de Comercio Argentina Tejana, o Tejana Argentina, Cámara de Comercio Argentina Tejana, I'm using what's known as a calque, which is to translate each segment more or less literally or directly, and then to rearrange them in accordance with the syntactic rules of the target language. That's a calque. The expression enjoy your meal is a single translation unit. You can't break it up. If I translate that as buen provecho, or simply as provecho, buen provecho, I'm using what I call a situational equivalent, a translation that you would say in the same situation, the equivalent for the same situation. I have another short sentence, visitarán la ciudad de Sevilla, that has two or three, maybe you could argue, translation units. Visitarán, which I translated as they will visit, that's a direct translation. La ciudad de Sevilla, here I left out la ciudad de in my English translation. That's an omission. And then translating Sevilla as Seville is using a standard translation or a lexical equivalent. Sometimes you can use, there might be two or more labels for the same type of procedure. And then finally, another source text in Spanish, source text unit, fuentes de energía solar y eólica, fuentes de energía solar y eólica. If I translated that as renewable energy sources, some of these specific notions are disappearing. I didn't say solar and wind energy. I sort of compressed those into renewables. And so that is what's known as a generalization. So again, what I'm trying to show is we're going from source text translation unit to target text, right, equivalent, and we're applying very specific translation procedures. The more procedures you know, the more tools you have, the more problems you can fix. Okay, as promised, I want to sort of tie together several of these key terms and concepts and suggest sort of a chain or a flow of relationships. You'll see that a lot of them break down into threes. So for me, the first very important thing is the genre. What type of text are we dealing with? What are the rules? What are the conventions, the things that constrain various factors about the meaning of that text, what it can look like, what it's about, how it can mean, right? One of those genre conventions is going to tell us, right? For any given text type, the genre conventions are going to literally dictate to us what the dominant language function should be. Is the dominant language function expressive, informative, or vocative, right? Is it trying to express emotions or attitudes? Is it simply conveying information? Or is it trying to get the reader to do something, the vocative function? Genre conventions are going to tell us what the dominant language function is, and as we saw earlier, there is a sort of correlation between language function and the type of equivalence that we want to emphasize or prioritize. Those equivalence orientations that come to us from NIDA and then Newmark are formal, cognitive, and dynamic, right? Are we aiming for structural equivalence, informational or message equivalence, or equivalent effect? Those line up also with maybe which of the translation approaches we want to adopt before we start to translate or as we translate. So again, there's sort of a correlation that flows through this model, right? If we're looking at a text whose dominant language function is vocative, like an advertisement. It's making an appeal to the reader. The equivalence orientation we definitely want to replicate is dynamic, equivalent effect. We may be somewhere between a balanced and a creative translation. And then based on that approach, right, what's going to be the unit of translation, the segment length that we focus on when looking for equivalence? Is it the individual word? Is it phrases? Is it sentences? Remember, the more literal, usually the shorter the translation unit. So again, there's sort of a lineup, sort of a correlation. And that choice of translation approach, translation unit, will be influential in telling us which translation procedure, which tool to take out of our toolbox to fix the problem. Is it a problem that deals with words, phrases, or sentences? So I just wanted to show you that there should be some consistency, that there are some natural correlations, that there's a flow from the genre convention to the dominant language function to the equivalence orientation we prioritize to the translation approach we adopt to the translation unit we focus on for equivalence, and then to the procedure or the tool that we take out of our toolbox. All right, and finally, I just want to end this presentation. I know it's been very long. Thank you for your patience. With a couple of slides about reviewing your translation, because that is the fifth step in the translation process I'm outlining here today. Interpretation, analysis, strategizing, reformulation, and then finally reviewing the translation. So what is an effective translation, and what can we do once we're done to enhance that effectiveness? Well, I believe that an effective translation is a target text that fully conveys the message of the source text. It has the same effect on its reader as the source text. It sounds natural to its reader, or at least to readers that are familiar with that genre. It replicates the source text's register and tone. It appropriately uses equivalent terminology. And it's a target text that is well written. In other words, it's clear, it's readable, it's coherent and cohesive. And also, it's free of any grammar and writing mechanics errors. There are no mistakes in spelling, capitalization, punctuation, use of accents. So an effective translation is one that conveys the message in the same tone, same register, has the same effect on source text readers, right? Sounds natural, uses the appropriate terminology, is well written, and doesn't have any mistakes. Okay, so now that we know what an effective translation is, what happens during the quality assessment step or phase? I like to break it down into 3 steps. The first one is, and these are things that happen after the translation is completed, right? The first thing that happens is a review. During the review step, we're checking the accuracy of the target text in terms of its content and information. Does it say the same thing as the source text? We're editing the target text for readability, natural use of target language expressive patterns, that sort of thing. And then finally, we're proofreading the target text to ensure that it uses consistent and correct appropriate terminology, it's conforming to established style guidelines, there are no mistakes in writing mechanics in the target language, and there are no errors of any kind. So that's usually something the translator will do step 1. Translator does step 1. Translator reviews his or her translation. Step 2 is going to be something that either the professor does, if you're in translator training, your instructor, or perhaps your boss, the person at the agency, the project manager. Evaluation is looking at how good or effective is your translation, right? Does your translation, the target text itself, the outcome, the product, does it demonstrate high degrees of cognitive, dynamic, and, where applicable, formal structural equivalence? And then finally, if you're lucky, although this doesn't happen often enough, a second step would be for your professor or your project manager at the agency or your client, if you have direct clients, to give you feedback. And feedback are those general and specific instructions that you receive, right, based on your performance, to help you improve as you go forward. So again, you do the review, and then your boss or your professor, your instructor, is hopefully going to evaluate your work, tell you how good it is, and give you feedback. Wow, congratulations to you if you made it all the way to the end of this video. Hopefully you did. I know it was a lot of information. Like I said at the beginning, you're going to want to rewind, review, pause, right? Think through some of these concepts because it is a lot of information to digest. So the video will be here waiting for you anytime you need to come back and review. And thanks for your patience, and hopefully you found this information useful. Until next time, hasta luego, ciao.